Welcome to Straight White American Jesus. I'm Brad Onishi, founder of Access Mundi Media, author of Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism, and What Comes Next, here today with my co-host.
I'm Dan Miller, professor of religion and social thought at Landmark College. Glad to be with you, Brad.
Always great. Yep, always great to be with you, Dan. Every Friday we get to hang and talk about the worst stuff, so it's the best. This week, we're going to talk...
It's like a best of times, worst of times thing. Like we hang out, but it's to talk
Well,
about
it gives
this
me a
stuff.
headache.
So-
I might need to go get some Tylenol, which we're going to talk about today, and just dive into what's behind the announcement from Trump and RFK about Tylenol and autism and all of that. We'll then jump into the rhetoric surrounding political violence. It seems as if we are getting close to a day when the Trump administration is going to label the Democrats a terrorist organization. They are getting very close, and we will prove that in a minute. And finally, we'll look at Tom Homan, the leader of ICE, and a scandal of him taking a bribe and the reactions from the right, which are basically like, who cares if he's corrupt? He's kidnapping people we want kidnapped, so leave him alone. This is the Straight White American Jesus Weekly Roundup. Lots to talk about. Let's go.
I think you summed it up all pretty well. We just called it a day. Like there it was.
So
It's like
yeah,
everybody gets a day off.
yeah.
Friday
I'm
off.
gonna go get some Tylenol. Cue up the reruns of The Wire. All right, Dan, tell us about Tylenol. Tell us about what RFK and Trump are up to. I'm sure people already heard the snippets, watched the news, read the tweets, all this stuff, but sort it out for us and let's figure out what's going on here.
Yeah, so for those who might not have heard, or just to tie some things together, the Trump administration, living out a kind of RFK fantasy, really, and we'll sort of come back to that, has advised pregnant women to avoid taking Tylenol, acetaminophen, if you buy the generic like I do, or paracetamol is what it goes by in like lots of other places, to avoid using it for any reason other than very high fever. And RFK said that the FDA would be changing safety labeling. There's plans to launch a public health campaign to improve awareness of this. The FDA issued a statement that was actually more measured than Trump's rhetoric might have suggested. Too bad nobody actually goes to the FDA website to read the statement, but this is what they said. The FDA said the doctor should consider limiting the use of Tylenol. Note the consider limiting the use of Tylenol, while also taking into account that it is the safest over-the-counter option to treat fever and pain in pregnant women, which can also harm maternal and fetal health. And in quotes, they said, to be clear, while an association between acetaminophen and autism has been described in many studies, this is very debatable, as I understand it from every expert in the field, a causal relationship has not been established, and there are contradictory studies in the scientific literature. So a more measured statement. The purported issue, of course, as it suggests, is a supposed link between Tylenol use among pregnant women and autism. Every major medical group, the medical community at large, international health agencies in other countries, they've all slammed this move. Nobody is behind this. The vast majority of studies, including a recent Swedish study looking at about 250,000 people, it was a really big study, considered sort of a gold standard study, found no association between Tylenol use and autism. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine have all extensively reviewed the data. None of them support this move. What does that mean? It means it's obviously not based on science or standards of medical care. Big surprise. So what's going on? These are the pieces why I think this matters, and the sort of broader takeaways of how this fits. The first is that it's just part of the quack medicine and the search for the quote unquote cause of autism. This is a long-standing issue among some on now the political right. This is a sort of snipe hunt that, in my view, didn't start on the political right. It started other places, but it's very much a part of right-wing ideology now. And it's really just a slight spin on all the discredited anti-vaxxer links between vaccines and abortion. This notion that autism, not abortion. This notion that there is some quick fix, like silver bullet thing we're going to find, that this is what causes this neurological development and so forth, and we can just stop using it and magically wave a wand and it's gone. I think it's whatever that is. And I also want to be careful. I'm not aiming to pathologize autism here, to talk about people who have autism or something like that. That kind of language is rife here. And I think that that's its own sort of concern or issue. I think also people get really confused. People who should know better, people that talk about autism rates have been rising and it's through the roof. And most observers will say it's because we have different diagnostic criteria. We have better tools for recognizing this, for recognizing that we call it a spectrum because it is a wide spectrum of behaviors and positions that people land on. And so people on the autism spectrum can range all the way from people who the average person in their life might be really surprised to find that out, to people who are nonverbal and need help communicating and different kinds of things like this. So anyway, point is, it's a complex problem and it's a search for a simplistic and simple solution. I think it's also throwing a bone to RFK Jr. I think this is just like a pet issue of his, and this is Trump, kind of giving him a pat on the head and saying, okay, let's do this thing, which takes it really far from the science. And I think there's also a patriarchal dimension to this. There's a dimension that I think feeds in all the other stuff on the right about the disregard for women's health and autonomy. We, for years, have seen a male-dominated party push against and regulate women's health care, whether it's abortion access or birth control. And this was also on display. Trump's advice to pregnant women, he said to fight like hell, not to take Tylenol, and to basically tough it out. Sorry, I hear pregnancy's painful. It's really hard. Tough it out. You can do it, kind of thing. From somebody who's never going to be pregnant, from a man who's never had to tough out anything in his life. This is a guy that, decided to complain like to the UN General Assembly that the escalators weren't working enough because Trump can't take the stairs. And we have to ask ourselves, would this advice ever be given to a drug that's prescribed to men? Would we ever tell the men, you just need to tough it out? It can cause problems. You need to just tough it out. So I do think that there's a patriarchal dimension here. The long and short of it is all of this, for me, is in a certain sense, it's nothing new. This is just another outflow of these impulses we have seen growing on the right for years. Appointing RFK to the position that he has was just pouring gasoline onto this fire. We've seen this, but it's going to impact public health and the well-being of lots of people, and it shows how ideology and loyalty is what drives this administration.
So I want to zoom in and zoom out. I want to think long term. I want to think short term. I want to think into the past. So here's the dimensions I want to look at. In the very short term, we went from Charlie Kirk coverage to Tylenol coverage. And if you looked at this week's news, if you watched legacy media, if you were on Blue Sky, if you were on your Instagram reels, it was Tylenol, it was autism, it was RFK, it was Donald Trump talking about this stuff. They're saying some of the dumbest things possible. Trump is saying, tough it out. Trump is saying, don't take Tylenol unless you really have to, blah, 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 blah. And I think everything you laid out makes sense to me. The thing I'm not hearing people talk about, the thing I'm not seeing in most outlets and most commentators and most coverage is this. The Charlie Kirk thing, let me back up. Charlie Kirk's murder, it's not a thing. Charlie Kirk's murder and the thing that followed, which was a myth-making in real time of making Charlie Kirk an American saint, okay, happened at just the right time for Trump. Because we were, Dan, like at one of those moments of like, the Epstein files might be coming. Like if you just backed up in the timeline and if you were like, what would be the most beneficial thing for Trump in the next month? It would be something that would disrupt the news cycles so heavily that getting back to Epstein would feel like a gargantuan, Herculean, almost impossible task.
And also something that would blunt the efforts of kind of his right flank calling for the Epstein, right? Like, so it brings them back on board. It brings them back into the fold. So it's both the media coverage and the sort of public awareness of that, but I think also on his own right flank, it blunts the force of the Marjorie Taylor Greens and people like that are calling.
It does, right? So like, think about it. If you have a place where, and we covered this, so everybody, let's just think back 2 and 3 months. We had Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene criticizing Israel, saying, I'm not sure that we should be involved with Iran and Israel and everything that's going on. That's happening. You had the Manosphere podcast bros saying, he won't release the Epstein files. I'm out, bro. I'm done. I can't believe I voted for this. He's a traitor. Charlie Kirk happens, the murder of Charlie Kirk, and then the following kind of myth-making in real time. You galvanize your base. When you're in wartime, there's no room for factions. So now all of that chatter, all of that, like, it's still there. There's still some people talking about AIPAC and Tucker, talked about at least in my view, the Jews killing Jesus at Charlie Kirk's memorial, the whole thing. But for the most part, the right flank, as you said, the critics of Trump, the calls for like Trump's a traitor, he won't release the Epstein files, that's gone. That's gone. Is Theo Vaughn and all those guys talking about that these days? I don't think they are. And then he comes out with RFK and it's like Tylenol and autism are linked and this and that and just quack science, as you put it. I think for Trump, this is sure throwing a bone to RFK. I think this is also just like, hey, watch this. Shot Charlie Kirk's memorial and the whole myth making in real time, labeling left-wing groups, major terrorist organizations, Antifa, whatever that is now our number one site. And everyone is just like covering that, me included. Okay. Then Chaser. Shot, Chaser. Tylenol. Throw in a crazy UN speech and you're, hey, Dan, how far are we from talking about Epstein now? Like, how are we even close? Is Epstein part of the zeitgeist? Is Epstein part of the ether? Are there journalists out there? What is every journalist in DC and beyond doing right now? They're chasing down Tylenol stories, autism stories, tariff stories. IKEA is going to be tariffed through the roof or out of the country. Epstein's gone. So I think that's one. I think that's just one you have to like, and I just don't hear enough people like sort of saying that. Number two is the long view for me historically is that Trump represents the breakdown of the post-war consensus. That after World War II, catastrophe globally was so universally agreed upon. What we just experienced as a globe was so bad. Nazis, Mussolini, fascists, Holocaust, war on almost every continent from Australia to East Asia to Western Europe, bombed out London. We're not doing it again. And for better or for worse, the U.S. became this global leader. It benefited economically from the war, and we're often running with the kind of post-war consensus that was in place since World War II. The U.S. and Western Europe and the UN all kind of holding things intact. Russia as an outlier, China as this dark horse, competitor for the last however many decades, blah, 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 blah. When you elect Trump the second time, you give license to say, I don't want that anymore. We're done. We're out of the UN. We're out of the Paris Climate Treaty. We're out of the world order. Go ahead, Putin, do what you want. JD Vance says, I don't really care about what's happening in Ukraine. And you know what else is there? The FDA, the CDC, and the United States, which has led on science and innovation for decades. And we're like, nah, we're done with that. Let's put quack people in every spot and tell you that, I'm going to use some words, that Tylenol is what leads to autism and this and it's just revenge porn. It's revenge authority porn. And I'll give you one example and I'll shut up. C.J. Engel is a renowned white Christian ethno-nationalist. And when the Tylenol thing came out, he said, don't trust anyone in science or medicine. Trust people on Twitter. Trust the trad wives. They're the ones who know what you need when it comes to your health. And it was just a complete like F you science, F you CDC, F you authority, F you post-war consensus, F you liberalism. I'm not trusting Tylenol because I trust the trad wives and the Twitter. He said, these were his words, Twitter schizos and others. So there's the short term, we're like light years from Epstein. There's the long term, which is like the Trump presidency represents the destruction of everything in the world that has at least kind of worked for the last 80 years.
There's been a phrase floating around, in the Trump world since the election of, flooding the zone. And they were talking about enacting policies and doing things like deploying the National Guard or firing people or whatever. And the point is just doing like a lot really fast, this kind of blitz, so that there just wasn't time to react to it. And we've talked about that a lot with the courts, the lag of the courts and the courts untangling that. And like, the Democrats figuring out how to respond to it and governors figuring out how to respond to it. We've begun to see that. But I think it's important to recognize that the flooding the zone strategy, when it comes to media, this is something that Trump has done for a really long time. I think this is tying in with your point as well of the constant distraction media stuff. And I don't say that to minimize the significance of this statement about Tylenol. I think it's a dumb statement for a lot of reasons, and I think again it can cause real harm and so forth. But it's flooding the zone to do what? Just to keep the news cycle continually moving. And we are not the ones to talk about this. They're the only ones. Everybody's talked about this. Media studies, people have been studying this for years. But one piece of the 24-hour news cycle, one piece of the commercialization of news, where CNN and everybody else, everybody from Fox News to CNN to YouTube, whatever, they have to get clicks because of ad revenue and whatever. And so you have to constantly have new topics to talk about. And so you keep flooding the zone, and that's what it does. And so, as you say, something like Epstein just sort of disappears and evaporates. And this will too. Next week, it's entirely possible. Who knows what is going to be the main thing? And it's going to be like, oh, remember that Tylenol thing? Wasn't there a Tylenol thing like 12 months ago that feels like a big deal? And that's what it feels like. And I think it's important to recognize that is also part of a strategic move by this administration, and they've said the quiet part out loud for months about flooding the zone. This is part of what they're doing.
Let's not leave this segment before just saying, and Dan, this is really your bread and butter, and it's something you're an expert on. You wrote a book, about queer democracy and a kind of national body dysphoria, and I think that comes into play here because I don't want to leave this segment without saying that RFK to me represents eugenics. And it represents the idea that if you don't have the right kind of body, then you're not worth it. And that, right, on this show and so many other places, we've talked about that in terms of if you don't have the right kind of body in terms of your race, your phenotype, if you don't have the right kind of body in terms of your sexual identity and who you love and are attracted to, if you don't have the right kind of body in terms of your gender expression, if you don't have the right kind of body in terms of you being a woman who doesn't know what having a body that can be pregnant or a body that menstruates, and obviously there are people who don't identify as women whose bodies do those things, then you're not worth it. But it also is like if you're disabled or different or divergent, you're not worth it. And I do think that's at play with RFK. RFK is a notorious, infamous, legendary womanizer who is like in his late twilight years of his life, who is still taking steroids and crank and going to military workout video sessions with Pete Hegseth. He wants to have what he thinks is the right kind of manly body. And I do think that blaming, when they say, quote unquote, you have autism, they're saying you're doing something wrong, rather than saying some of us have a body like this, a nervous system like that, a brain like this, a whatever, and just accepting the fact that there's a grand, wide, wondrous diversity of human incarnation, and that's a fact of life. We can call it good. We can call it all kinds of things. I mean, to me, it's good. To me, it's whatever. But to them, it is, oh no, you don't fit. And it's not just that that doesn't mean we don't like you or we're not attracted to you. It's we're not going to think that you're worth it. And we're going to create health conditions, public health conditions, that make your life either way harder or such that you may or may not survive.
Yeah, so I mean, you said a key word, diversity, and this ties in with everything else, anti-DEI initiatives and so forth. And we think of this in terms of primarily race or ethnicity, or maybe hiring people who have disabilities, things like that. But why, if you go take that meta level thing, like what is wrong with diversity? I think you get to that really affective, visceral, gut level response. The difference is just bad, right? We should all be embodied in the same way. We should all have the same kind of bodies and capacities and so forth. And as you're indicating, that spreads out throughout the social. I think it's worth pausing here that, I mean, if we just talk about women, we could go into the whole history of the medical establishment and women's embodiment and women being, dismissed as hysterical when they would talk about pain, and study after study after study that will talk about how women traditionally have been sort of disregarded or not taken as seriously when they report medical conditions to doctors. Or I did the series on It's in the Code on, the sexuality materials. And one of the things that comes out is, and it's shocking, is how much doctors and medical people still don't know about women's sexuality and sexual satisfaction and things like this, because it has not been studied anywhere near as much as men. Men have been the focus of this. And so you could go on and on and on to that point that female embodiment is already suspect in some ways. And I hear all of that when Trump says you need to tough it out. You're weak. If you need Tylenol, you're weak. You're not tough enough. If you got the trad wives out there tweeting about how, I don't know, you should never have pain and anything other than natural childbirth is bad and all the things that come with that. It's all part of that notion of making sure that the bodies are the right kind
Yeah.
of bodies. Feminine bodies are already
Yeah.
suspect
Yeah.
within that. And they have to fit into a sort of a narrower window for acceptance. I think this is all part of this. And you're right, everything about RFK, this is who he is.